Hello everyone, welcome to my basic guide to reactions. I wanted to cover this topic because I've seen a little bit of confusion around how reactions work in DC20, and particularly I've seen people bring over some ideas about how they work in D&D and thinking those apply to DC20, when they really might not. So let's get into talking about reactions. Well, reactions are actions that are taken off turn, and this idea is pretty intuitive to most people. You normally can't really take reactions on your turn unless they're in response to another reaction that's happening. So most of the time, this rule doesn't really come up too much because most of the times you're able to take reaction on your turn is because it's in response to some reaction. And importantly, reactions aren't affected by the multiple check penalty, even if they do happen on your turn because of another creature's reaction. So let's get a little bit more detail on reactions. First off is the idea of taking a reaction. Well, each reaction has a specified trigger, right? There's something that happens that causes you to take this reaction. And when that trigger happens, that's when you can take your reaction. Importantly, you can only take one reaction per trigger. So let's say I'm being attacked. I can only really choose to do one thing in response to that attack. But these triggers are very specific. If you're being attacked, you can use a reaction in response to being attacked, and then another reaction in response to being hit, because being attacked and being hit are two separate triggers. All right, then there's requirements for each reaction. These requirements can vary drastically, but oftentimes there's some kind of prerequisite. This might be having a martial feature, a spellcasting feature, or some other kind of feature. And this is going to give you access to that reaction. In some cases, this might be knowing a maneuver. And then on top of this, a trigger has to be met for you to be able to actually take a reaction, right? Just like we talked about before. All right. So let's talk about spending resources with reactions. This is something that I think hangs people up because in D&D you just have a reaction and you use that reaction. In DC20 that's not really the case. Reactions have a resource cost, just like any other action you can take. This could be action points, mana points, stamina points, or any other kind of resource. And you spend those resources to take the reaction. The neat part is that reactions give you an opportunity to spend things like action points outside of your turn. And this is important to think about with the way that DC20 is structured, which is that you regain your action points at the end of your turn. And this means action points that you spend on a reaction are functionally taking away actions you could use on your turn. If I spend 1 AP as a reaction, that means my next turn, I'm only going to have 3 AP left to do whatever it is I want to do. All right. Finally, there's this idea of taking multiple reactions, and this is probably one of the biggest differences from D&D. See, in DC20, there's no limit to the amount of reactions that you can take per turn or between your turns. The real limit here is resources, especially AP. So you can take as many reactions as you want. The problem is you still have a limited amount of AP. I can't really take more than 4 reactions because I don't have more than 4 AP to use all those reactions. Now, this rule is different than how we talk about 1 reaction per trigger. 1 reaction per trigger is saying that there's only ever 1 reaction I can take in any one specific moment. But multiple reactions is saying that I can take multiple reactions on a turn or in between turns as long as I'm not taking multiple reactions for a single trigger. Okay, let's talk about some specific cases of reactions, like an opportunity attack. This is pretty familiar to most people and an intuitive kind of reaction, although it's a little bit unique in DC20 compared to some other games because only martials can take opportunity attacks, or more specifically, only characters that have the martial mastery can take opportunity attacks. So this can include hybrid classes or someone who multi-classes into a martial class. So how do opportunity attacks work? Well, they're triggered by a variety of actions. It could be a creature moving out of your melee range, a creature standing up from prone while in your melee range, picking up an item, or taking the object action. There's plenty of things that could trigger this. And then on top of that, you have to spend 1 AP to make a melee martial attack as a response. So that is the action you are taking as a reaction to the trigger. Notably, you can spend things on this melee martial attack just as if it was an attack on your turn. You could spend 1 AP to get advantage, perform maneuvers, or even use other class features like a rogue's debilitating strike. Okay, let's talk about the kind of mirror of this, which is spell duels. Just how martials have their opportunity attacks, spellcasters have spell duels. But this is quite novel to DC20 and is unfamiliar to a lot of people. Spell duels happen in response to a creature casting a spell. specifically a creature that you can see casting a spell. That's the trigger. So what is the reaction? Well, the reaction is essentially you casting a spell. You say that you're doing a spell duel, and you spend 2 action points and 1 or more mana points to challenge the creature with a spell of your own. Importantly, you have to declare the spell duel after the creature makes its spell check or declares that it's casting a spell, but before you actually know the result of its check. So once you know the result of the check, it's a little bit too late to say that you're taking a spell duel. A GM might be lenient on this, but technically knowing the spell check affects you actually deciding to spell duel or not, because you know how hard it's going to be to duel. So let's get into the details of spell duels. First off, you got to choose a spell. Now, this is mainly a thing that you're doing for flavor, because when you're choosing a spell, you're kind of choosing a way to counter the spell, and it should make thematic sense, right? You're choosing a spell that should make some kind of logical reasoning on why it's going to stop the opposing spell. However, it's not going to cost exactly what the spell normally would cost, or do exactly what the normal spell would do. The spell you choose has to be able to target either the creature that is casting the spell or any of the targets of the spell that you're trying to counter. Alternatively, if you're using an AoE effect, it could even sort of counter or stop the path of the spell. So an example of this would be if someone is casting an ice knife, you could throw down a fireball in the path of the ice knife to sort of melt it in its path. Now, the important part here is that when you cast this spell, it doesn't resolve like the spell normally would. The description of the spell isn't really relevant here. So let's talk about resolving a spell duel. Well, when you're resolving a spell duel, the spell checks are made on both sides, and then you're comparing them to determine the outcome. So let's say you, the person who's doing the spell duel, succeeds, right? Well, that means the original spell that was cast is countered and fails with no effect taking place. If you fail on the spell duel, then the original spell succeeds and does take effect. And on a tie, the original spell fails, and both of the spellcasters, so you and the person whose spell you're opposing, are going to roll on the wild magic table. This could create a bunch of different wacky situations to come up in the weird and very rare cases where you're going to tie on your roll. And the important thing is all resources are going to be spent, regardless of the outcome. So it doesn't really matter if, you fail or succeed on the spell check, or even if you tie, the AP or an MP that you're spending on the spell is going to be spent. And that's the same for the person who tried to cast the spell in the first place. Okay, let's talk about held actions. Held actions are a little bit peculiar because they don't work exactly like all other reactions in the game, but they do allow for a very creative use of reactions. Held actions essentially allow you to create your own reactions, and they're decided on your turn and can't really be changed later. So let's go into the specifics of held actions. So when you declare a held action, you have to declare the action that you're going to take. So you're going to decide what is the action that you're going to use, and importantly, it uses the multiple check penalty or MCP of the turn you declare it. So if I've already attacked one time in my turn, and then I want to hold my action to attack something else when some trigger happens, well, I'm going to have that multiple check penalty because I already attacked once on that same turn. And then you spend the action points that are required for the action that you're trying to take when you declare that action. So on that same turn, you need to have the action points to hold that action, and it counts the MCP of that turn. Then you have to state your trigger. You have to decide what's going to cause you to take that reaction. This could be any kind of observable event, but it has to be something your character is going to see or notice. It can't really be something like 1 second passing, right? It could be an enemy moving into your range. It could be an enemy opening a door. It could be an ally walking away, right? All of these things could work because it is something your character is going to observe and see and notice. Finally, when that trigger happens, you could choose to take the reaction. Now, this is a choice. So when the trigger happens, before the start of your next turn, you could choose to take the declared action in response to that trigger. Importantly here is that it is a choice, so you could choose to not take that reaction, but it is limited. Your declared action or the whole held action that you made can only really happen until the start of your next turn. And if it reaches the start of your next turn and you didn't get to use your held action, that's kind of it. You tried to hold your action to do something, but nothing really happened and you weren't able to go through with it. Now, the important part is all the resources that you need to spend in addition to your AP that you spent before are spent in that moment when you take the reaction. So let's say my held action is to cast a spell. Well, I spend 2 action points on my turn to prepare that spell, right? To say, okay, I'm going to cast this spell when an enemy walks in. You spend 2 action points right there and are ready to cast the spell. But then the moment you actually cast the spell is when you actually spend the mana points, the MP, to actually cast it. So we'll see that the resources are spent at slightly different times. Basically, the AP are spent when you declare the action, and the other resources are spent when the reaction is taken. Alright, that's pretty much everything I wanted to go over as far as reactions. It's a relatively intuitive topic, but some people can get confused, again, because D&D does work differently as far as reactions go, and some people can get confused in that way. Hopefully this video helped explain a little bit about reactions and made you feel a bit more comfortable with reactions in DC20. Until the next time, have the best time.